Hello, my name is Sean Morris, and I'm going to be doing the opposition reply speech on the motion, "This House believes that publishers have a moral obligation to refuse to distribute deeply offensive literature." On the proposition side of the House, the three anticipated arguments are firstly, the principle of the social contract, secondly, reducing social disruption, and thirdly, protecting human dignity. On the opposition side of the House, the three arguments they would run are firstly, the agency of publishers, secondly, suppression strengthens extremism, and thirdly, offensive literature is a catalyst for change. With that said, I'll start on my first word. It's easy for the proposition to argue for minority rights when standing in the ivory tower of liberalism that is the United States. For the minority communities oppressed all over the world in authoritarian nations, they never had the liberty to label the majoritarian views that sought to oppress them as deeply offensive in the first place. Because we always understood that proposition had, yes, good intentions, but a very, very poor execution we are so proud to oppose in today's debate. This speech will be the most important speech in this entire round, as it's going to clarify and implicate why you're voting for side opposition all day, every day. I'm going to do something unorthodox here and start with the practical clash in the round, followed by the principle. On the practical then, the single biggest deciding factor on your ballot today is how exactly deeply offensive was going to be defined. You've heard the arguments here. This House believes motions in world schools ask us to look at the most likely manifestation of each world, because how I interpret deeply offensive surely differs from how someone else does, but even that doesn't matter. What do we tell you here then? We think that something being deeply offensive was likely to be defined as literature that was offensive to majoritarian groups, thus punishing minority work on their side of the House. On purely intuition here, something being deeply offensive is completely subjective and arbitrary. Was it going to be minority communities who don't have the agency to properly safeguard themselves to define this, or is it going to be the majority who sought to oppress them in the first place? Their entire worldview in this debate literally makes zero sense. Any socially progressive movement is viewed as offensive or radical to the status quo. On their side of the House, the minority suffers. Look to Florida, which banned queer literature from government-funded institutions. Maybe in some cases, the majority advocates on behalf of the minority for, say, hate speech not be published, but you're weighing on probability here. But secondly, though, even on their highest ground, where it really is hate speech that publishers refuse to distribute, how did this push fall completely flat? We tell you that suppressing genuinely bad and dehumanizing ideas in literature only pushes these ideologies underground and gives their supporters the ability to propagandize and victimize themselves. They only fan the flames of extremism and radicalization on their side of the House. This is especially true in the far-right autocratic nations that the proposition so wanted to place this debate under. Firstly, this policy is likely to be levied onto publishers at the pressure of authoritarian governments to silence dissent they deem as offensive. And secondly, in countries with growing populist movements, the harm of suppression far outweighs the harm of offending different groups overall. The weighing mechanism here is on magnitude, because dangerous ideologies can do so much more damage on their side of the House than any of the potential harms of offense in ours. Overall, society is more healthy on our side of the House when different ideas are circulating and constantly challenged. Weighing this clash against the principle, we think that the moral benefit of upholding this policy at proposition's best ground is outweighed by the practical harm of doing so. In terms of the moral obligation publishers have then, if the proposition lens this round has been that publishers shouldn't do things that enable bad outcomes, then if you're buying what we tell you on the practical clash, we fulfill that moral obligation in our world. On the principle then, their entire push here was on the social contract. They tell you that sometimes the agency and autonomy of publishers to publish what they choose needs to be limited for societal benefit, and that publishers owe a duty to the communities that allow them to operate. First, I thought it was very interesting that they used the social contract here, right? Because the philosophy of the social contract and John Locke's literature explaining what it was literally viewed as deeply offensive by the European monarchies in the Catholic Church that rejected the Enlightenment. But second, autonomy and agency was the prerequisite to accessing any social contract benefits insofar as you must autonomously opt into that contract in the first place. But thirdly, on our lowest ground, it was never the moral fault of publishers that certain people chose to consume certain literature, because the ability to access choice was always fundamental to a free society, and that is why we oppose.